Joining me today, Conservative MP and Chair of the Transport Select Committee, Hugh Merriman. Labour MP, Carolyn Harris. The Daily Mirror's Rachel Wearmouth and Professor of Politics at the University of Kent, Matthew Goodwin. Today,
we were reliant on the home quarantine system to work, and it clearly didn't.
300,000 travellers may have flouted quarantine rules. So how COVID secure were Britain's borders? How will the national insurance increase go down with voters?
The top 15% of earners will pay for half of the levy that will be coming through.
They're hammering working people. And we say it should be those with the broadest shoulders that should pay their fair share.
And Emma Raducanu's stunning victory sparks a political debate about immigration. And let's start with the issue of COVID passports. Passports that would entitle people entry into nightclubs, for example. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has been asked about this following questions over the weekend. Let's hear his response.
I'll be sending it all out tomorrow. At the moment, I mean, both Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, and Nadeem Zahawi, the Vaccines Minister, they're both right. And what we want to do is avoid vaccine passports if we possibly can. And that's that's the course we're on. But I think you've got to be prudent and you've got to keep things in reserve in case things change. Obviously, that's right.
Right, well, we're going to hear more about that, as Boris Johnson says. But Hugh Merriman, how can both Sajid Javid and Nadeem Zahawi be right on the issue of COVID passports when one is saying they should be brought in and the other is saying they should be dropped?
Yeah, that probably takes some doing in terms of how both can be right.
Which way should Boris Johnson go?
Well, it's my personal preference has always been, perhaps unlike some of my more freedom-loving colleagues, that if I can keep someone in a job by actually showing that I've been fully vaccinated, I don't have a problem with that. I think that's a good community thing to do. And perhaps the news that they may be brought in has encouraged more, particularly younger people, to get the vaccine and to get themselves safe and the rest of us safe. But it does appear that there's been a bit of a backlash against it, and it appears that they will not be coming in. But we will have to watch this space. If the rates tick back up again in winter, then may need to look at it again.
Right, so you would like Boris Johnson to actually back Nadeem Zahawi on this, the Vaccines Minister, and introduce those COVID passports?
Well, so I think my position is a little more nuanced in the sense that I don't have the same issue if we do bring them in. They're right to bring them in, because if it saves jobs and keeps people safe, I personally don't find it much of a price to show. Carolyn, where are you?
I think that we should be more careful around ventilation. I think we should be not forcing people to have a passport in order to access essential services. But I'd also like a translator when Boris Johnson's making his announcements, because I'm completely lost as to what he's trying to tell us he wants and what he doesn't want.
Well, Carolyn's lost, Rachel, in terms of what Boris Johnson does actually want and what he is saying. What can we expect from the announcement, the press conference that the Prime Minister is due to give, possibly as early as tomorrow, in terms of a whole range of COVID restrictions and laws?
Yeah, so we're expecting the Prime Minister to give this press conference tomorrow, and it's largely going to be based around how the government has a toolkit to deal with COVID this winter, and crucially how it will avoid another lockdown. So we're going to hear sort of about the repeal of some of the COVID regulations, including the power to close schools. We'll hear more about booster jabs programme. We're expecting also the chief medical officers to decide on giving vaccinations to 12 to 15-year-olds, which it seems highly likely that that's going to happen, given the government's already told schools to start preparing for it.
Do you think, Matthew, Boris Johnson might regret repealing or dropping and scrapping some of the COVID laws that are in place?
He may do if the cases continue to spiral and we end up having to have more drastic measures through the winter. But I think ultimately his instinct is probably where the instinct of his Conservative backbenchers lies, which is to try and learn to live with the virus, try to not be overly draconian in terms of using the state to try and interfere in people's lives, to try and push up that theme of individual responsibility that we saw Sajid Javid really push when he took over the health portfolio. And I think ultimately, Joe, what we're seeing play out in recent days is really a philosophical debate within the Conservative Party about the nature of conservative politics. What is conservatism in today's world? And Sajid Javid is clearly representing that sort of low tax, more libertarian wing of the party, saying, actually, I think we can learn to live with the virus while rolling back some of these draconian measures.
Right, we're going to talk about some of the philosophy behind the Conservative Party and its politics in just a moment. But can I come back to you, Hugh, on this issue? You said at the very beginning of the programme both of them can't be right, Sajid Javid and Nadeem Zahawi. Do you think the messaging's been clear? Carolyn says she's lost.
Well, I think the issue for us is we don't yet know what's going to happen, and only the Prime Minister can deliver that, and he will deliver it, I understand, tomorrow. My concern is when we just keep putting out mixed messaging before the event. I'd rather perhaps we just kept our head down, waited for the Prime Minister to give the statement, then we're not all speculating on who may be right and who said what. It's very confusing when we keep seeing or hearing so many different messages coming out which are not always consistent.
Carolyn, are you clear about what Keir Starmer thinks on vaccine passports?
Yeah, Keir Starmer thinks on vaccine passports that we need to be looking at alternative ways like risk assessments and making sure that there's correct ventilation and that we're not forcing people to have a vaccination certificate in order to go to work and to access essential services.
And are you also clear that he would keep all of the COVID laws?
I think that we need to be looking at the COVID laws because the chaos that we've experienced with the Conservative Party over the last 18 months, I think we really need to be looking at where we should be and where we are.
Right, looking at them, but we don't yet know exactly which ones he'd keep and which ones he'd drop.
I think it's down to the confusion. I don't think anybody really knows where we are with these things.
Right, well, on that note of clarity, we're going to talk to our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth. Let me just show you the story, the BBC story that has come out today, which says more than 300,000 suspected of breaking quarantine rules. Alex, tell us about this story.
You need to cast your mind back, Joe, to spring this year. So we just had that winter wave of COVID variants. We were rolling out the vaccine programme. And so the government introducing travel rules to try and stop new variants entering the country and undermining the vaccine scheme. And what that meant is if you came from a red, high-risk country, you had to quarantine in a hotel. Most other travellers who were entering the country had to quarantine at home, self-isolate for a period of 10 days. Now, during the period from mid-March to the end of May, around 1 million people came into England and Northern Ireland who had to self-isolate at home. Scotland and Wales had separate systems. Those people were subject to check phone calls and text messages to make sure they were sticking to the rules. But in 300,000 cases, there were doubts that they were following the rules. They might have not answered the phone or ended a phone call or refused to cooperate. So they were referred on for further checks, in-person checks, either by police or a private firm that was employed by the Home Office to do this. Now, the Home Office tells us it visited around 99% of the people that were referred onto it. But what they haven't said is how many people were then found to be following the rules, how many people weren't, and also how many people couldn't be traced at all. Now, what Labour says is this is the period that the Delta variant really took hold in the UK, and these figures show that there were holes in the government's home quarantine system, which might have allowed that variant to take hold more quickly. And of course, we know the consequence of that was that the restrictions had to stay in place longer than the government had wanted them to.
Alex, are you hearing anything around whether quarantine is going to continue more broadly? There were changes over the summer, but are we expecting anything on that?
Well, we know the government is looking at this because we currently still have this traffic light system in place for countries, so the amber, green and red lists that are in place. But we understand the government is looking at how that works. We heard from the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, yesterday, and he said he wanted to end the system of testing when you come back from countries as soon as possible, because the criticism is that's very costly for families and a real barrier to travel. So it's something that's being kept under review. So we are likely to hear something from the government about it. But of course, the big question that remains is what happens if there is another new variant that emerges? Because while the vaccine rates in this country are very high, There are lots of countries around the globe where the vaccine rates are still very low.
Alex Forsyth there, thank you very much. Hugh Merriman, in your position, of course, as chair of the Transport Select Committee, 300,000 may have flouted the rules, either deliberately or accidentally. What does it say about the travel policy of the government?
Well, it doesn't surprise me in the sense that we don't know how many people have not been absolutely checked. And I'm afraid that's the danger of a policy where, rather than force everyone to be in a hotel, we have to allow some travel at that period it's for essential travel. And so that means we rely on people to abide by the law. And what we don't know is exactly how many people did not do that. It was a nuanced policy which was based on trust, largely, with the threat that if people didn't behave as they should have done, then there could have been consequences. Some were dealt with, but it doesn't surprise me that Alex's work shows that we can't see those exact numbers. And actually, to a certain extent, the work that myself and my committee have been doing, again, we just cannot try and find the exact source of data from the NHS and indeed government in terms of what's been happening. So sequencing on PCR tests is a good example of that.
Right, do you accept that, Carolyn, that actually you couldn't have too blunt an instrument?
I just think it's classic. It was bound to happen, wasn't it, with this complete chaos when a government is reacting to the backbenches and coming up with confused policies that even travel agents and the general public don't understand.
But which policy are you referring to specifically?
Well, when we're talking about these 300,000 people coming into the country, that was inevitably going to happen because nobody really knew what they were supposed to be doing.
So you were in favour of closing the borders completely?
Well, we should have closed the borders sooner and we should have reacted more swiftly on a lot of things like the lockdown, and we didn't. And we find ourselves in a position where, yet again, we're going to have another disaster based on the fact that this government did not do what it should have done at the right time.
No, I don't really agree with that, because if we'd put those million people that Alex refers to into hotel quarantine, we wouldn't have had the hotels to put them in. That would not have worked. If we'd said you couldn't travel for essential reasons, so you're talking about people going over for really sort of quite heartbreaking reasons as well, this country does require people to abide by the law. We also know that there will be people who do not completely follow through on that, and there are consequences. When you're talking about 1 million people, you cannot check every single one. So I think it was a balanced policy, but the alternative approach the Labour Party had, which is to turn everything into the red list, put them in hotels. Firstly, you couldn't. Secondly, the aviation and travel industry would have been horrified by that, and it would have decimated them even further. So I wouldn't have supported that.
But I don't think that the industry is any better off now than they were then. I mean, they're still asking for clarity. All anybody wants to know is who's allowed to travel, where can they travel to, where can they come back from, and what do they need to do that? And nobody knows the answers to those questions.
Is it time to scrap the traffic light system altogether?
Well, I think it's certainly time to scrap PCR testing altogether. I feel that that's a form of...
And this is the day two when you come back from amber list. All countries.
I mean, let me give you an example of that. At the moment, if you're an HGV driver coming from amber France, you have a lateral flow test. If I'm coming from green list Germany, I have to pay £100 for a PCR test from a company that the Competitions and Markets Authority has described as having dodgy pricing practices. And the reality, Joe, is it feels like some form of state-sponsored racketeering, and I would like to see us drop that immediately. If it was because we want to sequence variants of concerns, then fair enough. But like Alex, I've done research on NHS test and trace data. It showed during a 3-week period in July, only 5% of positive COVID cases were being sequenced. So on that basis, there doesn't seem to be any point. It's stopping people travelling, and I would now like us to see us open up borders, or if we can't do that, we have to extend furlough for the travel industry. You can't have both.
I just hope we're not going to be reliant on the test and trace system to help us with this problem, because it failed before. It's not going to work this time. And 10 out of 10 for who? For knowing what it's going to cost someone coming back from somewhere else. And I'd love you to talk to some of my constituents and some of my travel agents, because they don't understand it. So well done, who?
Right, well, let's talk about the social care announcement and that hike in national insurance announced by Boris Johnson last week, and what it will mean for the fortunes politically of both the Conservatives and Labour. Hugh, there'll be another opportunity tomorrow to vote on the health and social care levy, as it's called, as the bill legislating for it will be presented to MPs. Will you back the national insurance rise as you did last week in the first vote?
Yes, I will. I had a good 30-minute conversation with the Chancellor to seek reassurance about that measure. But having decided that I would do so, I then voted in favour of it, and it would be slightly bizarre if I then went and voted against it. So I have my doubts, which is why I had that meeting. I spoke in the Chamber about those doubts. I quizzed the Prime Minister the day before. But I've now taken the view that we need to do this, do it now, and I therefore support it.
Right, but you've had doubts. What's actually changed? Because, as you say, you spoke up in the debate saying it cannot be right that a 27-year-old graduate who is paying back their tuition fees is seeing 42% of their pay go towards tax. That isn't what Conservatives set out to do. We set out to give people the opportunity to build dreams.
Yeah, and I absolutely believe in that intergenerational point, and I believe that those who would have a nest egg in later life should be using that nest egg rather than it being passed on to their children and then the wider taxpayer pay it. But let's be clear, and in terms of the question, why have I changed my mind? I haven't changed my mind. I've spoken to the locally, and they are really on their knees in terms of resilience. They need the money now. My concern, as you'll also have seen, is money will never come back out of the NHS, but for the NHS to get an immediate £7.4 billion off a simplified structure in terms of national insurance is more essential to me than the other reform parts where there's, as it was reassured to me, to argue about what type of reform we need.
Did you accept that? There's no alternative and that amount of money has to be raised?
A lot of whose constituents in the NHS will be claiming credit because of beyond low wages. They're already going to take a 20% on that, and now we're going to be asking them to pay more national insurance. It's not fair. The people who have got the least are being asked to have the heaviest burden on this, and it's just not fair. We need some kind of funding mechanism. And the other thing I don't understand is, why are we worrying about funding something that we haven't even got a plan? So let's see the plan and then work out the funding and come up with a reasonable and honest funding package that which tax issue and takes it from those who have more, not from those who have least.
To be fair, sometimes we put plans out and the argument is you're not properly costing them. Here we've actually said we will spend £11.4 billion per year to start with on the NHS. Of course, we will then work out how that is going to be spent, and it's important it's spent well. But with the best will in the world, back in 2002, the Labour Party also looked at the NHS, realised it needed an injection of cash, and decided that national insurance rises were the best way to deal with it. So, if nothing else, we're being consistent with how to fund the NHS.
We're not really consistent, because in 2019, Boris Johnson stood outside number 10 and said there would be no national insurance increases. So that's a manifesto pledge down the pan. We can't accept it anymore from him.
So I would be the first to say that all political parties, and I'm pretty sure that the Labour Party didn't pledge to increase national insurance back in the 1997 election, all political parties should stop saying they're not going to do something when it comes to taxes, because we never know about extraordinary events. And this pandemic and £400 billion later is an extraordinary event.
Johnson just won an election on one of those pledges.
Well, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let me bring in Rachel and Matthew. Rachel, the vote on increasing national insurance contributions has been rushed through the House of Commons. Is there a sense that the government is trying to manage backbench dissent?
I think that's definitely the case, yeah, because there'll be a lot of Conservative MPs, particularly in the newly won red wall areas, that will be getting questions about these measures from their constituents, not least because it comes at the same time as a lot of other difficult decisions, such as the cut to the £20 uplift to universal credit. That sort of starts fairly soon. We've got the end of furlough coming the end of this month. And there's going to be an income tax freeze as well. So there's an awful lot of, pressure on people's budgets that I think Conservative MPs are going to be asked about at the moment. Yeah.
Right. I mean, and Matthew, you mentioned the sort of philosophy of the Conservative Party. Most people would associate the Conservatives on the basis of what they say themselves as the party of low taxes, the party of business, the party of getting on through hard work. Has it lost its ideology with this national insurance increase?
Well, I think it's definitely in transition, Joe. You might have seen at the weekend some prominent Conservative donors coming out and saying that they are very unhappy with the direction of the Conservative Party because they really hold that low tax, small state philosophy that, of course, was most at the fore during the era of Margaret Thatcher. But I think fast forward to today, and we are seeing a very different brand of so-called one nation conservatism that is much more comfortable with using the state, much more comfortable with spending a lot more money, with raising taxes in order to do so. In fairness to Boris Johnson, though, I would just add that the issue of social care is one that was going to hit any government of any stripe. We are a rapidly ageing society. We need to rapidly integrate social care in with the National Health Service and come up with a much more detailed plan of how to do so. So somebody at some point had to grab this issue by the horns. For the Conservative Party, though, there is now a fundamental tension between the working class, typically lower income voters that Boris Johnson hoovered up in 2019, and the traditional true blue Tories, if you like, that live in the southern leafy shires, who are sitting on big houses with big pension pots, who are probably quite liking these moves because they're not really going to be affected by them. And that tension at some point, I think, is going to have some pretty profound political implications.
Right, well, let's just show, on the basis of that, this headline in the Daily Mail. Cabinet big guns warn Boris Johnson not to keep hiking taxes and increasing the burden on the public amid Tory anger over planned NI rise. Listening to what Matthew Goodwin has just said, Hugh, do you agree there is that tension now between two very different sets of voters?
Yes, I think that's a very fair summing up from Matthew. And I think my concern is there seems to be almost this presumption that when people get to the age of 65, they start voting Conservative. And there are now those in their 20s and 30s who would have been really won over by the sort of mantra we had in the 80s that you can make anything possible if you work hard enough. And now a lot of people feel that they can't afford a house of their own. They see their bills going up, so I absolutely readily accept that. We have got to win those people round, and we do that by giving them the opportunity. But now the tax take is high. That said, I'm fundamentally opposed to mass borrowing. £30,000 per man, woman and child at the moment in terms of our national debt. So at least we are now actually paying back this in terms of tax rises rather than just borrowing more and more, which, to be fair, was the accusation we made of the Labour Party in the last election.
Right, well, let's have a look at a couple of polls that were done, voter intention polls. They did actually take place in the wake of the national insurance rise and the plans announced by the government. YouGov Westminster voting intention put, for the first time, the Conservatives down on 33 and Labour ahead on 35%. I think we can show you a second voter poll. Opinion Westminster actually has them level pegging on 38%. That's worrying for the Conservatives, Matthew. Is there any evidence in your mind that some of those voters who have lent their vote to the Conservatives in 29, the new voters that you talked about, might return to the Labour Party?
Well, interestingly, Joe, when we drill down into those numbers, so far it's not the case that Conservative voters are defecting to the Labour Party. There are a very small number who are doing so, but the main direction of travel are Conservatives withdrawing from politics and going into apathy. They're saying they're not going to vote at the next election, or they're not sure who they're going to vote for. And then within that group, I think there's also a fairly significant number who are switching over to the Reform Party,
really?
which is now up to 10% among 2019 Conservative voters. Now, Joe, you might remember the first time you and I had a conversation, I think it was 2012, 2013, when we started to talk about the rise of the UK Independence Party, which was that problem on the Conservatives' right-wing flank. The last thing Boris Johnson needs, as these polls tighten, is another problem to the right of the Conservatives, as those classic low-tax, low-state, traditional Thatcherite Conservatives, if you like, begin to break off to another party. That's the last thing he needs, and at the moment the polls suggest that indeed could be happening.
Right, Labour need to win back those seats and those votes, don't they, Carolyn? Certainly a vast majority of them. And there's no evidence so far, according to Matthew Goodwin, when they've looked at the figures, that that is happening. How worrying is that for you?
I don't think it's worrying at all. I mean, like, Keir Starmer has not had an opportunity to really get out there, to set out his stall. This will be the first conference in September when he's had the opportunity to do that. He's done a really good essay today in the Fabians, which sets that proposal that he's got for the future. And I think now is the time, from now on in, when people will start to see Keir and start to see that he is a much better alternative to the current incumbent in number 10.
What is it that we haven't seen from Keir Starmer that we're going to see?
Well, he hasn't had an opportunity to go out and really set out the stall. We've only ever seen him in Prime Minister's questions or talking to a brown chair in his lounge. He needs to go. People need to meet him. He's spent the summer out and about talking to people, and we've seen from the reaction of people that they now get in Keir, and when they get Keir, they'll get the Labour Party.
I mean, is that really being borne out in the polls? I mean, yesterday the Sunday Times reported that Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, is in the process of writing a 14,000-word mission statement. I'll, of course, be reading every word of it. It's going to be published, I hope you will be, on the eve of Labour conference to outline, as you say, what he and Labour stand for. Is that going to do it for Labour? I mean, is that going to help them win?
It's a work in progress, isn't it? It'll be setting the stall out. It'll be an opportunity to have that speech. It'll be about changing the fortunes of the Labour Party. We've come from a dark place. We've had a lot of catching up to do, both externally and internally. We're getting to that point where we can start reflecting what the Labour Party will be doing for this country.
Rachel, I'm just showing everyone that headline in the Sunday Times that I was referring to. The Gospel, according to Keir Starmer, Labour leader prepares mission statement. Is that what you would have advised him to do to win back all those voters that were lost in 2019?
Well, I think a lot of the media criticism of Keir Starmer has been that, people don't know that much about him and don't know what he stands for. So it's kind of, I think, after 14,000 words, we should have learned a bit more about what that would be. I think it's usual for a Labour leader to set out some of their thinking before conference, which is due to take place sort of late this month. And from what I can gather, it's going to be these are going to be some personal reflections on this tour of the country that he's been taking over the last few months. So, to places like Blackpool and the parts of the Red Wall that they lost. So, and they're going to be more personal than on policy, I'm told.
Right. Well, talking of those voters in parts of the country like the North East, Francis O'Grady, the General Secretary of the TUC, has been speaking this morning, giving a speech at the conference and talking about what working people want to hear from the government. Let's have a listen to her.
Now ministers tell us they're going to level up Britain. But levelling up means nothing if they freeze workers' pay, slash universal credit, and the number of kids in poverty soars. So I have a challenge for the Prime Minister. If levelling up means anything, it must mean levelling up at work and levelling up living standards.
So, Matthew, is she right, Francis O'Grady, in terms of the risks ahead, potentially, if levelling up isn't realised?
Levelling up was the centrepiece of Boris Johnson's domestic policy agenda, and it essentially played a big role in allowing him to dismantle a big part of that red wall. And so far, my personal view, Joe, is that the Conservatives have not made the most out of that. We still don't really know what levelling up means. There is, of course, a white paper forthcoming on this. We don't know how to measure it. We don't know how to evaluate it. We aren't able to point at particular areas and see which ones are doing well and which ones are not doing well. And that's part of the reason I've been working on levelling up and trying to build an index with the Legatum Institute on that very topic, because the Conservatives really need to get their hands around it. If they don't, by the way, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer really need to come up with their own plan, because levelling up isn't going anywhere during the 2020s. If Labour wants to win back the red wall, well, they need to set out their levelling up strategy. How are they going to level up these areas? And so this issue we're going to be talking about for the next decade or so. And both parties, my personal view, have not really articulated what they mean by this policy and how they're going to measure its effectiveness.
Hugh?
I agree with that. And funnily enough, we've just done an inquiry on infrastructure and we asked the question of the Secretary of State, what does levelling up mean? I'm not sure we got a definition. So that may well be one of our calls when that report comes out. The key is you look at projects like the Humber Bridge, which was a toll bridge brought in. Hull still has the highest unemployment after that. So value for money is never factored in. I think it's even more of an issue now that projects can go ahead that do help on regeneration scores and also on net zero. You could find that value for money is even less forthright in the spending decisions. So we need to know what it means and how you measure it. But ultimately, of course, I support it. We want to see those that have the hardest times in terms of life chance opportunities given something to their area. But it's important that we spend the money well, coming back to this point of value for money.
Right, and how long do you think you've got, or the government has got, to actually provide something tangible?
Well, we come back to this point about the voters that, as you put it, may have lent us our vote. Those people want to see real change in their communities. And we know how, again, coming back to my infrastructure report, how long it takes to actually get things through the planning stage. So I think the government need not just to look at the big projects, but some of the smaller projects that can also be transformational, but can be delivered by the time the next election occurs.
And Carolyn, what's your view to Matthew's point that the Labour Party should be moving in on this territory, or at least have their alternative levelling up?
Yeah, and we've talked about British, buying British, manufacturing Britain, and this is where we need to go to actually go into these communities and provide them with the resources to do that. But for me, levelling up at the moment is just a slogan that goes from one government department to another. There's nothing actually happened with it. So we really need to move forward. These communities can't wait anymore. We've got to get something done.
Does that wash with you, Matthew, from Carolyn's side, from the Labour perspective?
Well, I think ultimately the voters, not long from now, Joe, I mean, we could potentially have a general election in early 2023. So really, they've only got a little over a year to come up with a detailed policy of what they're going to do. And the key message, for me at least, having looked at the evidence on this, is infrastructure is really not the main part of this. It's only a part of it. And we've seen Rishi Sunak throw billions at infrastructure. We really need to think about how we're going to fix a productivity problem in the UK, how we're going to drive enterprise and good local environments that support businesses outside of London and Oxbridge, the so-called Golden Triangle. And so far, at least, the evidence for that is very thin on the ground. So the clock's ticking.
Right. Do you think Keir Starmer will include that in his 14,000-word mission
And in his
statement?
speech, hopefully.
I heard that. Now, you may have had the good fortune to watch that rather stunning tennis match on Saturday evening. Well, politicians across the political spectrum have been praising the victory of Emma Raducanu in the US Open over the weekend. Now, the 18-year-old is the first British woman to win a major tennis trophy since Virginia Wade in 1977. Now, I'm going to show you this tweet from Nigel Farage because he was one of the many politicians to praise that achievement. He, of course, the former leader of the Brexit Party and UKIP. He said this on Twitter: "A global megastar is born. Emma Raducanu winning the US Open is truly incredible." But there was some controversy in response to that tweet from him. The Labour MP, Diane Abbott, tweeted this: "Extraordinary hypocrisy from Nigel Farage. After her triumph at the US Open, he is keen to praise Romanian heritage star Emma Raducanu, but not so long ago, he was saying he wouldn't want a Romanian family to move in next to him." Now, Diane Abbott is referring to Emma Raducanu's heritage. She was born in Canada to a Romanian father and a Chinese mother and then moved to London at the age of 2. Was Diane Abbott right to criticise Nigel Farage?
I don't think that we should be turning this wonderful victory into anything else other than it is a wonderful victory. She is a young woman who has done a fantastic job through her A-levels, through the tennis. We should be praising and singing about the wonderful things she's done, and nothing else really matters at this moment.
Right. Matthew, do you see a tension between Nigel Farage's comments? And they do date back to comments that he made in 2014 on LBC Radio. I think he also made them on other occasions. He said, "I was asked a question, if a group of Romanian men moved in next to you, would you be concerned?" And he said, "If you lived in London, I think you..."
On the Labour side of the political divide, you could certainly make that argument, and I think you could argue that some of the statements that were made previously about inward migration from Eastern Europe perhaps have been undermined by some of the contributions that migrants from Eastern Europe have made to the country. But to be honest, Joe, I think the vast majority of people are looking at this particular debate, rolling their eyes and seeing politicians trying to make a political battle over something that really has very little to do with politics. Most people are just wanting to celebrate the fact that somebody who's very young, was an underdog, came into this Open and blew everyone away without turning it into a left-right political battle.
All right, well, let's bring in Sunda Katwala, Director of British Future think tank, looks at issues of immigration and integration. Hello to you, Sunda. What was your reaction to Diane Abbott tweeting about Nigel Farage's comments? I mean, is it fair, and can people campaign to cut immigration and at the same time praise Emma Raducanu?
Well, I think it's right to say this is foremost just an incredible sporting achievement that you don't see more than once a century. And so I think the keyboard warriors and the people having the political argument have to keep in mind that, you know, Emma Raducanu hasn't asked to be sort of the next theme of the culture war. I think Nigel Farage did overstep the line with what he said about Romanians in 2014. I remember the Sun newspaper called him out at the time, saying, you know, it's one thing to complain about European free movement, but it's another thing to stereotype the whole group. So I think that was an example of being over the line. I think we can't, say this changes everything about Brexit or immigration. It's a tennis tournament. It tells us something positive about British identity that we all agree on, actually, that migration and integration are something we can make work, are something that contribute to our national team, to our sporting success, but actually to our country. And so, this doesn't settle the difference between free movement and a point system, but actually in terms of identity, we can look at how Emma Raducanu talks about her own identity. If you look at her Twitter feed and Instagram, her description of her identity is London, Toronto, Shenyang, Bucharest. She's actually quite typical of her generation, where mixed ethnic heritage is an everyday story of your family links for many people, and she wears that with ease and confidence and pride. So let's not have too big a fight over the politics of it. Let's actually celebrate that.
Right, Matthew, do you agree?
I think I broadly do. I mean, I think there's an interesting argument emerging, I think mainly, again, among the keyboard warriors that Sundar alludes to around there are issues as well around educational mobility that are raised by this case, in that we aren't. I think I'm right in saying that that Emma went to a grammar school and that may have experienced some advantages that other children of her age didn't. But I think so. Seeing these debates in different aspects of them raging online, I do agree with Sundar that, in the whole, this is a case that we ultimately want to celebrate and support. And in a way, one of the things about the diversity debate, and one of the things that irritates me about this, is we jump so quickly to one side and essentially force that argument down people's throats that we alienate the sort of moderate middle, who probably would have gone along with the argument anyway, of saying, well, this is a wonderful sporting achievement, let's all celebrate it. Oh, they're turning it into politics again. Oh, here's an MP or the Mayor of London or whoever trying to turn this into something that it isn't, which is, it's just a sporting achievement that we should rally around. And we saw that again, obviously, with the Euro Football Championships. And I think sometimes politics needs to leave the room, and we just need to focus on who we are as a country and rally around that fact.
Rachel, do you agree?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on here. I would be concerned generally that we start to categorise anyone from an immigrant background as an other, and we start talking about them in that way. But I think when it comes to Nigel Farage in particular, it's more how he's spoken about the issues in the past. So everyone has a right to freedom of speech, but you don't have a right to be heard, and it is how he's particularly targeted groups previously, and I think that's why people react so strongly to him kind of wading into these debates, because he's built a career on kind of weaponizing division, really. So if you don't act in good faith in that way, you kind of don't get to sort of speak without being questioned on those issues as well.
Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, I've said what I said, Joe. I mean, I think it's a case that my personal view is we should not be turning every sporting moment, every passing event into a political battle over the left and right. I think most people are not really wanting to turn these things into a political tussle.
Right. I mean, but Sundar, it's interesting that you've written about this and said that people with liberal views on immigration shouldn't see Emma Raducanu's triumph as a gotcha moment. What did you mean by that?
I think it goes too far if you say because we won the tennis, it proves you're wrong about Brexit or free movement. I mean, if your view of immigration is send them all back, then clearly you're hypocritical. If you've got things like the great replacement theory, where someone with mixed ethnic heritage like myself or Emma Raducanu is always a threatening other in the statistics, then you should rethink that. But exceptional cases are exceptions, grand slams and gold medals, and it's the everyday story of integration that really matters. We shouldn't write off sport as a debate about identity. It's really important because it's when we have identity debates that involve millions and millions of people. Sport has done a great deal, actually, to broaden the sense of who is British and who is English in my lifetime. Emma Raducanu sees no doubt that she can be English. She's wearing the 3 lions at Wembley Stadium in the tweet sent out by the FA and the English football team. So we should welcome the way in which sport tells us that story, because sport is so young and so youthful. It's a little glimpse of the demographic future. There are going to be more British, Chinese, British, Romanian, mixed ethnic heritage Britons part of our national team. That's something to recognise, celebrate, welcome as something where we can have a shared identity, but just be a bit careful about always turning it into a battle with our opponents.
Right. I mean, you were nodding through that, Hugh. I don't know which bits you actually agree with. But in terms of should politicians leave the room, should they not make comments in the way some of them had? We've shown some examples, or celebrate and talk about identity in the way that Sunda has outlined.
I just feel on this one that we should be using one word, and that's winner. And that's all that counts, not arguments about immigration, generations, genders. Let's just recognise this phenomenal talent and the resilience and actually courage that she's shown to all young people who've really suffered during the pandemic. There are issues with anxiety and whether young people really can feel they've got the confidence to make it. There's one person standing up in that arena, delivering the goods for herself, most importantly, but also for our country. So I agree with everyone. And I do wish that politicians would just not turn it into another row. It's really depressing. We should just bask in the glory, celebrate her success. That's what I use my social media for. And why does everything turn into an argument about whether Piers Morgan was or was not right? It's so depressing.
Does everything turn into an argument about that?
Well, I don't mind arguments and discussions, but surely bask in the success of one young person and her greatness. And yes, show it as what people can do when they come to this country, as well as whether they were born in this country.
Right. Do you think it will, actually, her success then make some people have a more positive view of immigration and mixed heritage?
I'm with Hugh on this. I think her culture, her background is nothing to do with her success. And no wonder people get apathetic about politics when they hear us doing these things and bringing politics into everything. Let's just celebrate this wonderful success and say, well done, girl.
All right, well done to her from all of us. Thank you very much to Sunda Katwala for joining us. We're going to turn to issues in Scotland and the SNP conference with Nicola Sturgeon talking about a second independence referendum. We can talk to Alexandra Mackenzie, BBC's correspondent up in Glasgow. Hello to you, Alexandra. Exactly what has she been saying, Nicola Sturgeon, and is the government ready to make its case for independence?
Well, yeah, she covered quite a lot of things in her speech, which she has just finished. And this was the end of the SNP conference, which was online and has been ongoing since Friday. She gave that speech from her home. She obviously talked about independence. She also talked about COVID. She talked about vaccinations. She talked about COP26, which will be happening in Glasgow, just across the river here. But on independence, which she left to the end of the speech, she got into that by talking about Brexit initially. She talked about what she said was the damage caused by Brexit. And she said that...
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt, Alexandra, because I've realised we've only got a few minutes left and we need to hear a little bit of Nicola Sturgeon. So let's play a bit and then we'll get you to comment.
Absolutely.
We see all around us the evidence right there in front of our eyes. The evidence that independence works. For countries of Scotland's size, independence works. Our neighbours in northwest Europe are wealthier than the UK, all of them. They are more equal than the UK. They have lower levels of poverty. They have higher productivity, which drives better living standards. All of them recovered better from the financial crash of 2008. They have stronger public finances. As a proportion of pre-retirement wages, they all have higher pensions. And of course, they all get the governments they vote for. In measure after measure after measure, the evidence is overwhelming and conclusive. Independence works. It works for Denmark, for Ireland, for Austria, for Norway, for Finland, and for so many others beside.
Alexandra, so she's setting out the case for why. When are we actually going to see it?
OK, well, what she would like to see it at the end of or in 2023. So in 2 years or less than 2 years' time. And she talked very much about cooperation, not confrontation, when she was talking about that independence referendum. And she said in the spirit of that cooperation, she hopes that the Scottish and the UK governments can reach an agreement. as they did in 2014, to allow what she said was the democratic wishes of the people of Scotland to be heard and respected. Now, she did say that some work had begun on the referendum campaign. Yes. She said civil servants were working on that, but she also did say that coronavirus was her priority. Okay. The NHS is the priority, and making sure that she takes Scotland safely out of the pandemic.
All right, Alexander Mackenzie there in Glasgow, thank you very much. Thank you to all of my guests. Although, just as we go out, Hugh, do you think Boris Johnson will ever relent on that giving permission for the referendum?
I doubt it.
Right, and on that, I will be back tomorrow at 12:15 with more Politics Live. From all of us here, bye-bye.